welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm Jen, and today I am joined by my illustrious co-host.
Hello, I am Jessica. Thank you, illustrious other co-host.
And today we are both joined by a verified friend of the show at this point. I think this is your third appearance, and we're here to talk about a whole slew of books because you've had like a phenomenal year. So congratulations on publishing like 9 million things. Like, it's amazing.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's been a very busy stretch. That's good.
Great. So we are here to talk about Alter Ego, the sequel to Secret Identity, one of my favorite books of the past few years. And we'll also be talking about ENCANTO, Nightmares and Sueños.
Which is about Bruno. So we're going to be talking about Bruno. And I have been ready for this since ENCANTO came out.
So
Oh, good. I'm ready.
Yeah. The first question I have kind of concerns both because both books came out on the same day, just about 2 weeks ago. How did you do that? Like, how was that intentional or like what?
I mean, no, it wasn't by design. I think, I guess age range, the books are very different. So it didn't feel like it would be redundant to have both books come out at the same time. I felt like, the Encanto book is technically a middle grade novel, though I always write the same way I write. Like, I think, my son read the Encanto book and it didn't feel like it was written, quote unquote, down to a younger reader. But I felt like they were different enough where they wouldn't hurt each other coming out at the same time. And it felt like a good all boats rise type situation.
Very cool. And I think
I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
it absolutely did. I think it's really neat to offer something to two different sets of readers at the same time.
Absolutely.
Although the press tour, I imagine, was probably really busy for both.
Yeah, it was. But if I was promoting Alter Ego or doing an Alter Ego event, Encanto would be on sale too. And so if people bought Alter Ego, I said you could buy this for your kid or for your nephew or whoever is in your life that is a young reader or wants to read the story. So it was a nice kind of hand selling yourself, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I think a good pairing. And I mean, who's to say that fans of Alter Ego don't want to read about Bruno too?
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
there.
Cool. So in terms of Alter Ego, this is obviously a sequel to Secret Identity from a couple years ago, which was just an absolutely phenomenal book. I'm curious about writing what is called a standalone sequel, because I've seen it referred to as such in some places. And I'm curious about how you balance, being accessible to the newcomer while also like rewarding the return readers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I think it was really hard. I've not been shying away from that. I think the easier path would be to just have made a direct sequel where you kind of continue Carmen's adventures, but I also felt like Secret Identity was the Carmen adventure, and I felt like I would be watering that down if I continued with her as like a serious protagonist, like investigating comic book mysteries through the years. I think that could have been interesting if that was my intent to start with, but I'd always envisioned Secret Identity as a standalone, and then when this second potential story appeared, I knew it would have to feel tonally different. It would need a new protagonist. It would need to feel like it was on equal footing, not a continuation. And so Alter Ego can be read on its own, and you don't lose any of the power of that story, I hope. But you do get a little more texture if you read them together and you read the Lynx comic book as well. So they're kind of like both sides of the same coin. Carmen and Annie both have very similar trajectories in that they're given their dream on a platter, but they don't realize that this dream that they're handed is very complicated and very fraught. And so it's about them overcoming those challenges to achieve it. And I think that's resonant, but it's also, there's no homework required. And so that was really the challenge, to write a sequel that was not a direct sequel, but was more like a spiritual sequel without the trappings of that kind of like new agey term. It exists in its own way, but it's in the same universe as Secret Identity. So that was trickier.
I think that, one thing that is nice about those books, though, is that when there is a universe that might have smaller sections where the light is shining slightly, but hasn't been 100% illuminated, it does add to further exploration, right? Like if you're going to do a sequel or you're going to make a series, you're going to have to keep going back to certain characters 100%. But if there's lore out there that has been left untouched, that means you can play in your own sandbox a little bit longer and explore it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having the backdrop of Secret Identity and having those areas that maybe I didn't get to mine as much in Secret Identity really opened up some potential story. And I think it's kind of fun to read Alter Ego knowing Secret Identity. Like you kind of see like a bunch of Easter eggs from Secret Identity. And but even if you haven't read the book, it stands on its own. And that was really the hard part. And I think the key was Annie was finding a protagonist that was as compelling as Carmen, but not kind of like Carmen 2.0. Because if that was the case, then just write another Carmen book.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Annie. She
Oh, thanks.
her first appearance at the 2009, was it, Comic-Con? New
Mhm.
York Comic-Con, is it just like she is perfect. Like it's just such a perfect like meet cute, I would say, for me and her, like in a parasocial sort
Oh,
of.
good. Yeah, yeah. I had a lot of actual comic creators say like I've been on that panel before, so
Yeah, it
just
brings
like the Annie panel, and I could
go
definitely
ahead.
brings back memories, and I could very much relate to like the publicist in the back. I used to work in publicity, so like kind of hovering in the background and like just dreading whatever the talent is going to say on the dais.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt very visceral for somebody who has attended Comic-Con as a guest and as a sort of press
Yeah.
person. It is, yeah. And that moment too in time, like 2009 is super interesting because I feel like it was right before Comic-Con sort of went through like a really blowout expansion, of like what it did and just like the scale of it. And that brings me to my next question that there is a time jump in between Secret Identity and Alter Ego. And I love that that allows you to like comment on, comics culture and history like in its different phases. What was it that you felt like you wanted to address in this one about like the state of comics?
Yeah, I think the thing that I found fascinating about Secret Identity is I was writing about this comic book industry that was no didn't exist anymore. Like this, it was much more of a trade. It was something people did. It was not done with the intent of like, oh, this is going to be a movie or a show, and I'm going to own this character. It was more like, I got this assignment to create the superhero. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to move on and do the next thing. And this is something I'll do until I get something else. And it was very workmanlike. Um, Whereas Alter Ego, we're in a world, the modern day comic landscape is a world of like intellectual property and multimedia stuff and maximizing your IP, like all these corporate hot buzzwords that really just mean tell a good story and own your story. And there's so many opportunities for creators to control their stories and be a part of it that didn't exist in the 70s. And I wanted to show that, but also show how predatory some situations could be and how important it is to think about, well, is the risk worth the reward? Like the key, I'm not a theme writer, but I did look back and I realized that one of the big themes of the book was art and art versus commerce, and the idea of like, what do creators have to sacrifice to get their stories out there? And are those sacrifices worth the risk? And I think that's what Annie struggles with. Like she wants to create the story with the links because the links was so important to her as a fan, and that sense of identity really carried her through some very difficult times. But when the people that quote unquote own the character aren't good stewards for the character, like what can you do to overcome that? Obviously wrapped in the bow of a murder mystery thriller. Um, so yeah, I really wanted to show kind of under the hood. I think people know comics and they know the characters and they know it's all over the place. Like you have a WandaVision TV show, Moon Knight, like all these obscure characters from our childhood are now like A-list media stars. But I don't think a lot of people know like how the sausage is made, for lack of a better term, like how these things come together and what those meetings are like. I think it's just great context and backdrop for a thriller, I thought. And then having the comics. Now I don't want to like toot my own horn, but it felt like a really nice setting for a thriller. And then having the actual comics give you insight into Annie's subconscious. Like you're in her head, but you're hearing what she wants you to hear, kind of. But then you look on the page at these comics that she's drawn and labored over as a fan, and you really see what she's struggling with in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of her struggles feel so relevant, like to I think things happening in entertainment right now. I'd love if you could talk a little bit without, like revealing to whatever detail you wish. Her experience with Miss Midnight, and sort of
Ugh.
the way that, intellectual property, when it overrides the concept of art, can result in like these, yeah, really not great scenarios.
Yeah, it just felt like I joke that it's like ripped from the headlines. I mean, obviously, it's happened in the real world where movies are shelved for tax reasons, and it just felt like a really sharp friction point with art and commerce where the business side can just say, oh, let's just write it off. We'll make more money writing this whole production that hired hundreds of people and cost millions of dollars. We'll make more by writing it off than by actually making the thing or distributing the thing. And that feels like, I mean, I think every creator has experienced that to some degree, like a project being shelved or being canceled or just feeling that brush of like the business side. And I'm not saying that the business side is perpetually evil, but or evil by default. I just think that sometimes those decisions affect the creatives in really jarring ways. And I wanted her to be reeling from that, but also be confident in her abilities in a way that Carmen wasn't yet. Like when we meet Carmen in Secret Identity, she hasn't gotten a break yet. And even her first quote unquote big break, nobody knows she did it. Whereas Annie is a much more established, and she's confident. She knows that she's good at what she does. She doesn't need like Triumph Entertainment or Arturo Spinoza to tell her you're gifted, you're great. She knows that she is. And I thought that was a compelling kind of gear shift from Secret Identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does make similar points about like yeah, art versus commerce, but it does show like just how the landscape has changed so much.
Mhm.
So we've been talking about something that we are allowed to talk about so far, and I want the mystery to unfold for readers. I am always so
Yeah.
afraid of revealing mysteries. So let's turn to something that we don't talk about and we are talking about for the first time.
Bruno.
Oh, yeah.
So first of all, one of the questions I always want to ask an author who is jumping into writing in an IP or writing a character that has existed before is how does that work with the IP holder? Are you, as somebody who has written in other IPs before, like, do they come to you or do you go to them and say, I have this idea. What about, writing a book about, Bruno, who's a beloved character in Encanto, but we don't see enough of him. Even
Right.
though I think he gets more screen time than his sisters when you really think about it. But I think he's
Yeah.
like the breakout character, right? He's like the character that people really latched on to and wanted to know more about. How did that work?
I mean, it can work both ways. You can pitch something and get a response from the rights holder, or they can reach out to you and say, "Hey, we know you've done X or Y." In this situation, Disney Books reached out to me and said, "Would you be interested in doing this?" And I immediately said yes because my kids love Encanto, I love Encanto, and it just felt like what a huge honor it would be to not only write something in that world, but such a definitive moment, like basically chronicling why we can't talk about Bruno and kind of digging in and feeling like, well, what are my strengths and what can I bring to this character and to this world that would be interesting? And that took me a minute to kind of wrap my head around it, but I was really happy with the result.
So where did you begin? Did you get any insight into maybe some Bruno lore that we weren't given in Encanto? Or did you sort of float a few ideas and toss them out to Disney and say, what are your thoughts about this? I'm assuming, being that Encanto was such a big property and Disney does like to play in those sandboxes a little bit more, in case there is a second Encanto movie or there's more Encanto products or, books out, that you might have had some parameters.
I think generally I knew they wanted it to be a prequel. They didn't want it to be a sequel, and I assume that's because there's probably more stories to tell on that track. And doing a prequel, one of the benefits of doing a prequel is that you have this box. Like you can only go so far, and you kind of there's the comfort as a reader of knowing, well, these characters will be okay, but it's interesting to find out this story. But that's also a challenge. Like, how do you create suspense when you know the characters will be fine, quote unquote, fine, or will continue? So I threw out some ideas and we went back and forth and they were always, I think one of the cool things about writing for Disney is they want your voice to be unique. They don't want you to just feel like you're doing like Encanto point 0.5. They want it to feel like tonally different. And I really wanted to focus on Bruno and give us as much of him on the page as possible, of his insights and his worries and his struggles, and also the vibe of like what was it like in Encanto before the movie and before, years and years before even the grandkids were born, and we got to meet them. So it was a lot of like becoming reacclimating myself to the movie and really like immersing myself in that lore, but also realizing what do I want to say? Like what do I want to talk about here? And I think um the theme of the book is really like to be yourself. There's we can always try to be what everyone else wants us to be, but you're the more you do that, the further you get away from your true self. And I think the challenge is for Bruno is, he has this great ability, but sometimes it's not the best news. It's just because he can see what's going to happen doesn't mean what he's going to see is good. And so once he starts changing that, it really affects him in not great ways.
I suppose in a way he's sort of a kindred spirit to Cassandra in the way
Hmm.
she can give a prophecy, but nobody's going to believe her. For Bruno, he will give a prophecy, but they don't want to believe him.
Right.
They don't want to hear it. And that's a lot of, it's a big weight to know what's going to happen and it kind of be, you see it in the movie too, where he's like, okay, this might not be what you want to hear, but you're going to have to reach out to this sister who's been kind of obnoxious to you. And Mirabelle's like,
Yeah.
oh, and he's like, every single time. And that is why he is withdrawn because he knows that his news is not going to be received in a good way necessarily.
Yeah.
Necessarily mean
Yeah.
it's always bad. Sometimes it's like, sometimes it's just how things go. But
It's just a great big responsibility to have that power. And I think that was the Bruno arc. And then I thought, well, what if you then throw in this other kind of villainous, quote unquote, character into the mix that sees the lay of the land and is able to, I don't want to spoil what happens, but is able to manipulate these characters for their benefit. And that made for an interesting, I thought, narrative. And it was fun to just play with these iconic characters like, Pepa, Julieta, Alma. Like it's just really like a great cast. And then to be able to tie it into the bigger mythos was really fun.
what about like when you talk about Alma, the mother, she's such a divisive, or the grandmother, I suppose, in
Hmm.
Kanto, she's such a divisive figure. When you talk about her to people, some people felt like she was a little bit more redeemable, or, people thought that she got off easy. Did you have a hard time kind of writing who she was at that point? I would imagine, she's still kind of in the middle because she had lost her husband, but she still has all three of her children. And then when we see her later in Encanto, she's sort of further from all of that. Did you have trouble kind of skirting the line with her?
I think she's a complicated character, which I think is fascinating. I think, she's trying to hold the ship together, basically. She's willing to make tough decisions to make sure that she retains this safe space and this magic and this community that she's built. And it's really all she has, which is a lot. So I found that if I leaned into that and made her sympathetic, but also unflinching, that would make her interesting. And I really like complicated characters appeal to me. I'm not interested in just like staunch good guys or bad guys. Even I think even the villains in the book are fairly relatable. Like you kind of understand why these things happen. And there's also characters that are in a gray area that aren't really sure whether they're quote unquote good guys or bad guys. And that's interesting to me. So I tried to, I mean, that's my whole vibe with a lot of stories. So it was fun to bring that into this world.
So another question I have is there an audiobook and is John Leguizamo going to be narrating it?
There is an audiobook. John Leguizamo is not the narrator.
I shouldn't say no because I don't want to insult the narrator. I'm sure the narrator is fabulous.
He is. No, Anthony Ray Perez, who did the Pete Fernandez novels. He's
Oh,
actually a very great narrator. So I'm excited to work with him again. Also did Nightmares and Sueños. So
I guess like another thing I wanted to know, is it hard for you to switch gears? Is it hard for you to get into the different headspaces of these characters?
um, it's it's funny. It took me a while to figure out how I do it. And sometimes you just do it instinctively, but the time I would spend on research for like a secret identity or an alter ego or like chipping away to figure out who Annie or Carmen are, I would spend on these work for hire books, like immersing myself in the lore. So it is kind of another kind of research, but like for the Daredevil novel I'm working on, I just spent a lot of time reading Daredevil comics and realizing like what a mess Matt Murdock is and how complicated he is and how he makes bad choices but is still a good guy. And with Star Wars, it's similar. It's like kind of hyper focusing on the era. Like for the Battle of Jakku comics, I read a lot of the books that fall into that almost liminal space between Return of the Jedi and the Battle of Jakku and before Mandalorian. So the same thing happened with Encanto. I just kind of rewatched the movie, listened to the soundtrack endlessly, and really use that to figure out where in that space were stories that I could tell well and what characters fit where. So it's different, but it's very similar in terms of like immersion and trying to find a place where whether it's finding the character and discovering the character, which is usually what happens with my books, or finding my voice within these characters that are already there.
What's really interesting to me with like, adapting things from multimedia,
Mhm.
properties where you are talking about novels and graphic novels and film and TV, that there are so many influences that you are drawing upon because it's not just like the text, but it's also like the performance in the case of John Leguizamo and the voice actors and the teams of writers and for comics like the artists and all that. Like it's a lot of you have to wrangle. And that's not even really a question. That's just a comment really, but it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, it is. There's a lot to wrangle. There's a lot to think about. And I also find it's very easy to get lost in that because it's research, it's work. But I think there's also a point where you realize I need to start writing the book. And I've kind of been in the pool. I've gone swimming. I kind of know what the lay of the land is, and now I need to get to work. And I think that's the hard part sometimes for writers. Like it's very easy to get lost in research. I could have read like 100 more books about comic book history and IP and Hollywood, and read 100 more comics, about Daredevil or what have you. But at a certain point, like you know enough. You know enough to start writing, and if you hit a fork in the road where you need to look something up, you can do that. Or if I needed to reference something, like there's, like an Encanto Wikipedia type site, and Star Wars has Wikipedia. Like there's a lot of resources for like that little fact. You don't have to just keep reading and reading and reading to like immerse you're never going to immerse yourself in everything. So I think the challenge is knowing when to just go.
That's fascinating to me. Yeah, I feel like everything has, if not its own wiki, fandom.com seems to
Yeah.
be just this wealth of lore from different different fandoms and different IPs. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's useful in terms of telling you what stories to read. Like I wouldn't just use the wiki entry as information. Like I use it as like a springboard. Oh, let me dig up this comic or let me look at this episode or, it's a guide for that, which is good.
That's what I used to tell my students. I'm like, Wikipedia is the beginning of your journey, not the end.
Yes. It should not be the end. If it's the end, something's gone wrong.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like it's a good grocery list.
Yes.
I
Mhm.
suppose.
For sure.
I'm just very excited about this. I'm very excited.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope you like it.
Yeah,
Nice.
I'm sure I will.
Are you like writing 9 million more books right now? Like where where are you at?
I'm working on the Daredevil novel, trying to finish that up ASAP, and then I'm a chunk into my next crime novel, which is a little bit of a political thriller with elements of organized crime, with a female protagonist in Miami and New York, and what else? And I'm doing a lot of comic stuff. I'm hopefully going to get to write another dark space novel with Rob Hart, which will be good. And those are the big things. So that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking time out from that extremely busy schedule to
For sure.
Well, I'm really thankful. Yeah, I'm thankful to hopefully get a little bit of a break. I just went on book tour and that was amazing, but also like really exhausting. And it's kind of hitting me today of all days. Like, even though I've been home since Friday, like I was telling my agent today, I was like, I feel very tired today. And he was like, yes, you are a human with limitations. Like, you should sit quietly somewhere and like look at the wall.
to remember. So
Yeah, but thanks for always supporting my work. And it's nice to be here. And anytime you want me back, I'm happy to do it.
Excellent. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
If there was just sort of a dream IP that you could write in, like you could go and you could say, I have this idea, I would love to write in this, what would it be?
I've gotten to write Spider-Man a little bit. I mean, I'd love to tell a Peter Parker Spider-Man story. I would also love to tell a Batman story. I wrote him a little bit in the question number one, like he has some lines of dialogue, and even then it was like, oh, I'm typing Batman words, and it was pretty neat. I've always loved the X-Men. I love the theme of the X-Men. I've written Sunspot and I wrote a Polaris short story, and that was fun, but it would be cool to write like an X-Men team book. I also love Buffy. I know as fraught as that property is, but I love Buffy. So
Buffy fans seem to be very aware and responsible about the fact that it is that there is some landmines within Buffy, and it's been
yeah,
very interesting because Jen and I are both original Buffy fans, and
same.
it's been very interesting to kind of see how people, because it still is an IP that people are writing in and producing in, so you have like Amber Benson and Christopher Golden's Audible series.
Slayers, yeah, that was cool.
I wish they could have done more of that. We had spoken to them about that. That was really clever. But then you also there was that book Big Bad that that we did too. And it's just very interesting how people really, it's like they address the elephant in the room, but they also don't address the elephant in the room. And it's in a very playful and responsible way that, as somebody who is still a Buffy fan and also very sad about certain things,
Yeah.
Can really appreciate and jive with.
Yeah, it's good that they're trying to find ways to tell more stories in that universe, and I would be open to hearing more or reading more.
Yeah, me too. Well, maybe one day that's what we will talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Talking about Buffy after talking about Bruno.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect.
Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah.
Good encore question. You just keep the audience coming back for
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
All right. So listeners, you're going to check out Alter Ego. You're going to check out Encanto, Nightmares and Sueños. You're also going to check out the legendary Lynx, which I didn't even bring up yet, but there is you have produced a comic from this world.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really kind of, I mean, as we were doing Secret Identity, Sandy Gerald, who did the amazing illustrations for Secret Identity and Alter Ego, we those are interstitial moments or excerpts from the comics. And so when they were written, I was like, okay, let's do a 3-pager here, and it'll probably be from the middle of an issue. This will be a last page splash. This will be an opening splash. But it was never cohesively woven together. But as we were doing it, Sandy and I kept saying, well, there's a full comic book here. Like we should do it as a full comic book. And then I thought, well, let's do it like it's a lost reprint. Like we're actually taking these files that were never collected or remastered and putting them out. And so we did it. We did 4 issues worth of comics. We added a bunch of pages. We colored the art from Secret Identity and some of the pages from Alter Ego, and we did it very much in world. So we were treating it like it's this reprint from this lost series. And J.M. DeMatteis, who I love his work, I'm a huge fan of his work on Spider-Man and Justice League International and so many comics, wrote an intro tongue in cheek, basically saying I read the Lynx while I was starting out at Marvel, and it was a huge influence, and I know it influenced Alan Moore, and basically like putting it into historical context. So I tell the story a lot, but one of my favorite parts about Secret Identity is when people would email me and say, I love the book, which obviously every writer loves to hear that. But, I went to the comic shop and I couldn't find the Lynx comics anywhere. Like they wanted to believe that this character was real. And now it is. Now it exists. And if you want to read those comics, you can read them. And if you want to believe in the Lynx, it's real now. So
I love a good meta story,
Yeah.
like where something just kind of turns around and becomes, pops into existence because of other sources. Yeah.
For sure. And I do also love I think it is the theme park kid in me that loves this is an artifact that could exist in that world, and now I'm
Yeah. I love that kind of stuff. I love meta stories. I love Cavalier and Clay, and I love the Escapist comics that they did in partnership with them, and just things like that make you feel like you're part of this. You're living in this world, like this parasocial thing where you're actually there. So, I had fun with it, and sometimes you just need to write for yourself and hope that somebody else likes it too.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, this is our third ending now, so let's
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Not that we're not having fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.